Hi, Paul Duckett here. You've probably heard from Michelle that I can't make our Thursday lecture in week 11 because I'm just recovering from an illness. I'm fine. I'm on my way back to health. Should be fine for next week, so I hope to see you in the lecture next week. So in place of my lecture, I've recorded this little vodcast video recording for you, which just takes you through the PowerPoint for my first lecture on history and theory of psychology. Okay, I hope to see you next week. Cheers, bye. So this is APP 1012, History of Psychology, Part 1. Now these are the learning outcomes for the unit around which everything is focused, and my two lectures will mostly be providing you with a way of achieving learning outcome 1 and to an extent learning outcome 2, but primarily it will be learning outcome 1 because it contains the key phrase evolved over time, but also the phrase current issues. So today, here is what we will cover. We will look at history, i.e. psychology over time, outlining the approach that will be taken in terms of whose history are we looking at and how far are we looking back. Then I'm going to give you a quick view of what psychology looks like today, i.e. current issues, and I'll be picking up on a couple of controversies our discipline has recently been confronted by. And from that, I will be giving an explanation for a particular way of making sense of the history of psychology. So our first question is, whose history are we talking about? Aboriginal history of Australia looks different to that of white settler history. So there are many different histories out there. For our two lectures, we'll be looking at a very specific bit of history. We will focus on US, European and UK history. So we're going to ignore an awful lot of world history, and that's because the psychology that you've been taught so far, and most of what you will be taught, has been doing just that, focusing on just 3 geographical areas. And we will only start our history from the late 19th century because psychology was not a recognized profession prior to that. So what does psychology look like today? Well, you can purchase the magazine Psychology Today. This is a US magazine that's intended for the public. It aims to make psychology accessible to the public, to the general population, and that magazine might tell you something about how psychology sits in the public imagination. So psychology is out there. It has significance to people outside of universities. It's estimated that around 3 million people read this Psychology Today magazine. It's one of the top selling consumer magazines. Readership is going up just when the readership for most magazines is going down. But let's turn to another source. Let's see how the profession presents itself to the public by looking briefly at a recent promo video from the American Psychological Association. I'm just going to show you this video. It takes about 30 seconds.
How can we use our science, our theories, our methods to solve that problem?
I can basically ask any question I want about how we behave.
It's fun because you get to think about complex relationships.
I've got the ability to take the data and to think critically about what might really be going on.
What I love most about my work has to be the potential to make a difference.
I'm a health psychologist.
I'm an organizational psychologist.
I'm a neuropsychologist.
I'm a conservation psychologist.
So that's how psychology looks today. And in these two lectures, we'll offer you an answer to the question of how we got here. And by that, I mean, what is the history of psychology? To answer that, we'll be moving through the 20th century, and we'll see the shifts between 4 of the major schools of psychology, which are psychoanalysis, behaviorism, cognitivism, and biological. Now, I won't give you a rich understanding of each of these, as you'll be getting that as part of your degree in general. What you'll get from me is an overview of how these schools sit in a historical context. But it's important to remember this sequence. So it's psychoanalysis, then behaviorism, then cognitivism, then biological. But first, let's have a look at how psychology looks today by looking at some of the trouble that psychology has got itself in. Psychology has recently been faced with two major controversies. Psychologists' involvement in torture in the coercive interrogations used by the United States in the War on Terror, and psychologists' involvement in the diagnosing and treating of mental illness. The torture controversy has come as somewhat of a shock to the profession, whereas the mental illness controversy has been much more of a slow burner that is slowly heating up, and it might become a full-on crisis by the time you become professional psychologists. We just don't really know at this stage. So to the first of these. The torture controversy came to a head with the publishing of the Hoffman Report in July 2015. The report was part of an investigation into the American Psychological Association in regards to accusations that it had been involved in torture. The report concluded that the American Psychological Association colluded with the Department of Defense to allow torture techniques to be used in interrogations and for psychologists to be involved in those interrogations. Now, by way of background, on September 17, 2001, President George W. Bush signed a memorandum of notification granting the CIA authority to covertly capture and detain individuals who posed a threat of terrorist activity. On January 11, 2002, the first detainees began arriving at Guantanamo Bay, where both the CIA and Department of Defense had set up interrogation facilities. Now, I just want to clarify, it was the Department of Defense, not the CIA, not the Homeland Security, or not the Department of Justice that the APA were found to have colluded with. And this is important, get your facts right, in case you find an exam question on this. So it was the Department of Defense, okay? Department of Defense colluded with the American Psychological Association. Now, the American Psychological Association did take action following the publication of the Hoffman Report. Here you can see a picture of the vote taken by the APA Council of Representatives at its annual meeting in August, held in Toronto, and where they're voting to bar psychologists from national security interrogations. Now, to the second controversy. Here's a recent fact sheet on depression from the World Health Organization. You see that depression is referred to as a mental disorder and as an illness. And here is the results of recent research undertaken by the University of Queensland, published in the Public Library of Science. This is part of the narrative of an epidemic of mental illness. And here you can see that those countries most affected by this epidemic are in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, the controversy is over whether depression, schizophrenia, and other mental illnesses are actually illnesses, and whether we should be actually using this medical language to describe these things. You know, this talk of epidemics of mental illness. Excuse me, a little cough. Now, in 2005, Robert Plonin, a world authority on genetic causes of human behavior, revealed that apart from Alzheimer's, not a single gene has been shown to play a critical role in any mental illness. That means none. None of around 300 diagnostic categories of mental illness that at that time existed. And Robert Plomin said that there is no evidence that the genetic material of schizophrenics, depressives, and so on differs in any way from people without the illness. Now, people like Mary Boyle, who's a professor in clinical psychology, have stated that there are no reliable biological or physical markers for mental illness. There are no biological or physiological differences between people who do and do not have a mental illness, and there are no tests or scans that can show a person has schizophrenia, depression, mania, and so on. However, this is controversial. Many psychologists claim that there are biological causes to mental illness, and many psychologists claim that these things have been found. I'll just give you the reference to the Robert Plomin material just there. Okay. Now, let's turn to the 5th version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, published in 2013. This is one of the key tools used to diagnose mental illness, and you become familiar with this as you go through your training in psychology. Now, next to it is a quote from the Coalition for Informed Patients and Doctors in the US of America. They say, "Few lay people or even therapists realize that psychiatric diagnosis is not a scientific endeavor, although some of the most powerful people and organizations in the mental health field assert that it is. As a result, millions of people who seek help because they're suffering have no idea that they are not being diagnosed in scientific ways, and thus that their treatment largely lacks a scientific basis." So views like these has led to such things as, for example, in 2013, the UK Division of Clinical Psychology in the British Psychological Society issuing a statement to say that it was time to give up on the mental illness model. And so what we see is psychology being embroiled in these two controversies. It's embroiled in the controversy with those who are opposed to torture, and it's in the controversy in regards to those who are opposed to diagnosing and treating mental illness, particularly in regards to the profession of psychiatry, but also to psychology. Now, in relation to mental illness, you'll see psychologists disagreeing over this topic. So you'll be told by some psychologists in your training that mental illness exists, and you'll be told by other psychologists, like me, that mental illnesses don't exist. They're not medical conditions. You've got to decide who's right. So who is right? How do you rule out the lies from the truth? And who can you trust? How are you expected to find out who is right and who is wrong? How are you expected to find out who is telling the truth in all of this? Well, at this point, I want to bring in more of a focus on learning outcome 2 in your unit guide. Something behind this is about the basic principles of the methodologies used in psychological research. Basically, what this learning outcome allows us to do is examine the nature of truth. And there are two separate ways psychology has gone about defining truth. There's positivism and social constructionism. Positivism states that knowledge and truth reflects an objective reality that can be measured. And social constructionism says that truth is socially produced and there is an inescapable relationship between truth and power. We'll look at this a bit more in our next lecture. So you will have a little bit of time to get your head around these ideas. But just for now, think of this in relation to knowledge constructed from experiments done in the laboratory, which is positivism, versus knowledge constructed from people stood at podiums giving their political speeches, like Donald Trump. And that very much reflects a social constructionist view of knowledge and truth. Now, in our lectures on history, we're going to employ the social constructionist view of truth, as it gives us what I believe is the most fruitful way of exploring history and psychology. It gives us this key question. It's not to look at... I'll start this again. Key question, right? Let's get it right. It's a key question. So it's look not only at what is said, but also at who says what about whom. This was famously stated by Pierre Bourdieu. And basically, what it's asking you to do is, when you're asking if something is true, you should ask, in whose interest is it that we believe it to be true? Who benefits in us believing such a thing to be true? And to answer such questions, we're invited to consider the dynamics of power as they operate in society. Now, from the history of these two different approaches to knowledge and truth, what we see is positivism feeding into a quantitative approach to research, where we look at numbers and analyze those numbers through statistics to discover meaning. And social constructionism feeds into qualitative research, where we look at words and images to discover meaning. And these two different approaches are seen to be quite oppositional. The image just in front of you now it's not really intended to convey anything other than two people sort of staring out at each other. Though they could be looking at each other in a loving way, I suppose. But it's to point out how there's an antagonism between quantitative and qualitative work. I've used here some brain images because brain images are reflective of the dominant school in psychology right now, but we'll talk about that in the next lecture. So quantitative and qualitative work reflecting positivism and social constructionism are kind of oppositional, really, in psychology today. Now let's go back in time to the first key event to mark in our history of psychology, and this is 1879, which is the opening of the first experimental psychology laboratory by Wilheim Wundt in Germany. And this picture here is of Wilheim in his laboratory, sat at a chair, surrounded by other psychologists. You note that they were considerably more smartly dressed than the likes of your psychologists like me these days. There you go. And here is Wilheim in his laboratory having a good old think about things. And here is a psychology laboratory in full swing. So then, back in those days, they just stared at pieces of card. Today we have advanced considerably. Now we just sit and stare at our computer screens. There you go. Progress. Now, Wundt's laboratory was before the information technology revolution, of course. So that's why there's no computers there, because this is, late 1800s. But I want to talk about computers and the computer revolution more just shortly. What's important to note here is that Wundt believed that psychology should use both qualitative and quantitative methods. This is the thing to think about in terms of that first experimental laboratory. He felt that experimental work and quantitative work should sit side by side with qualitative work. Now, if you remember that, you'll be showing signs of having a better understanding of the history of psychology than many people have, because people think back to the early days as that's where experimental psychology began and that's where psychology became a quantitative science. But it's not the case. It was both qualitative and quantitative in those days. Psychology was believed to need both forms of knowledge to get an understanding of human behavior. Okay. Oh, sorry, that little text box is basically saying what I just said. So on to the next slide. Now, what's happened since the opening of that first laboratory? Well, we've seen a number of major schools of thought come into psychology and change what psychology is. Now, here is a little cue for an exam that's coming up for you soon. It's important to remember this sequence, okay? So it's psychoanalysis, then behaviorism, then cognitivism, and then biological. Don't worry about critical psychology that you see on this map in front of you. We're not going to talk about that just now. So in front of you, this is the history map that I've produced for us to show the schools of psychology, but also to map on some key historical events that were happening through the late 1800s through till today. And what I've done is to pick out 4 different threads. So we have war, particularly World War I and World War II, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, and the present so-called War on Terror. We'll look at the last one of these in terms of its impact on psychology. We've got the Industrial Revolutions. There are 4 of them. 3 of them have impacted on psychology. The 4th Industrial Revolution is the one we're in at the moment. It's happening right now, and we're not really fully aware of how that's impacting on psychology. The 3rd strand is politics and economics. So there's free trade and globalization, and then a shift through a system of capitalism that's changed over the years from Keynesian capitalism to neoliberalism. The thing we'll be focusing on there is neoliberalism, which is the present dominant economic system. You got our lovely Donald Trump sitting there at the end of that timeline. And the 4th strand is the social movements, the civil rights movements, beginning with the workers' rights movements, 1700s, and the women's rights movements, 1880s, indigenous rights movement that began 1910 and also, black civil rights movement, LGBTIQ movement, psychiatric survivor movement, and the disability movement. Okay, what I want to do is focus on one of these just now, which is the Industrial Revolutions. And this is just a little video to give you a flavour of what was happening in that first Industrial Revolution.
In the late 1700s, most people worked in the fields on land they did not own. Those who owned the land, called aristocrats, lived refined lives in elegant manor houses. Servants raised their children and did their housework. The landowners and the people who worked for them depended upon each other. It was a system that had existed for centuries. In towns across England and the United States, a series of extraordinary innovations would alter the way people lived and worked for the next 150 years. Inventors had found new ways to harness nature's energy. They built new kinds of machines powered by water, steam, and coal. The new machines replaced hand-powered tools. They did the same work, only cheaper and faster. Much of the work was done outside the home, in specially designed buildings.
Okay, so that gives you
the first factories.
That first Industrial Revolution. So let's have a look at those industrial revolutions. So this goes further back than the history of psychology or modern psychology. So what we have to do is scrunch up our little timeline there a little bit, just so that we fit it into these 4 industrial revolutions, the timeline for those. Now, the first industrial revolution was the mechanization powered by steam and water. And that's when you first started seeing the big factories being built and mass production. The second industrial revolution was the factory assembly line and mass production powered by electricity. So it moved from steam and water through to electricity. The third industrial revolution was the development of electronic and information technology. So this is where robots started entering into the factories and on the assembly lines. And the fourth industrial revolution is the one we're in just now. It's the automation of complex processes. People often refer to it as the Internet of Things, where electronic devices, buildings, vehicles, even our own bodies are now becoming interconnected through web and cloud-based technology. It's also an age where we're seeing developments in virtual and augmented reality. So this is known as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Now, it's too soon to say how this Fourth Industrial Revolution is impacting on psychology because we're immersed in it at the moment. We haven't fully seen the effects of it. But what we can do is see the effects of the first three industrial revolutions on psychology. So let's have a whiz through to consider what was happening during these industrial revolutions in terms of what was the impact on society. Now, things were starting to move faster, quite literally. There was the mass production of high-volume goods on the assembly lines, particularly of automobiles. There were new ways of generating power that were fueling the new factories. So we had large hydroelectric and thermoelectric power production plants and distribution systems. There were low-cost appliances for the mass market, such as vacuum cleaner and washing machine and electric cooker. There were quicker ways of communicating, so radio, telephones, phonographs, high-speed printing presses, enabling the production of low-cost newspapers and mass-market magazines. There were faster ways of travelling, so fast and comfortable long-distance travel by trains, but also planes and automobiles. We also, at that time, society was getting fuller to the extent that the cities were getting fuller. This was called urbanization. Urbanization was moving at a rapid pace. So what was happening here was there was a mass migration of workers from the countryside into the cities, because the cities were where the big factories were. And what you saw during this time were big steel-framed buildings of great height being constructed, the skyscrapers, and increasing population density in urban areas in our cities. And the third aspect was that society was getting fitter or healthier. So here was the discovery of new vaccines and antibiotics and massive improvement to sanitation and hygiene. Urbanization was creating this urgent need for disease prevention, because when you had large numbers of people all crowded in together, epidemics were even more dangerous and needed to be prevented. This was also a time which saw the strengthening of corporations as they began to exploit economies of scale in materials and equipment acquisition, and also in manufacturing and distribution. And corporate exploitation in turn led to the creation of strong trade unions as a countervailing force. And this period also saw the rise of mass market advertising and consumerism. So we had nationwide branding and distribution of goods replacing local arts and crafts. Now, we're going to move from that world outside of psychology to connect to what was happening inside psychology and show you what a history of psychology can reveal. So we're going to connect psychology with what was happening with the Industrial Revolutions. Now, here are some familiar faces for you. If they're not familiar yet, they will be soon in your studies. So in psychoanalysis, we had Sigmund Freud. And in behaviorism, we had John B. Watson and B.F. Skinner. And in cognitivism, we have Jean Piaget. So, Freud and psychoanalysis took as its object of inquiry anxiety, stress, chaos, and it put drives and emotions and instincts at the heart of our quest to understand human emotion and behavior. Now, this was happening just at that time when society was rapidly transforming, when cities were becoming densely populated, and people were getting worried about so many people in the streets. You know, how to make sense of what was looking like chaos, a mob in the streets. How do you control people? How do you make sure people don't start running amok and causing a riot? Now, Watts and Skinner in the School of Behaviorism, they took their object of inquiry as human behaviour and sought to find ways to control behaviour through systems of rewards and punishment. And human nature was seen as machine-like, responding automatically to stimulus in the environment. So this was just at the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, the automation of machinery, the assembly line with workers in the factories, almost becoming like robots engaged in repetitive and tightly controlled tasks, and with people each having separate tasks to perform. And finally, on to Piaget and the School of Cognitivism. This modeled human behaviour on the computer. Cognitions became the object of inquiry as psychology became fascinated by the way that we learn and make decisions. And this happened just at the time when we entered the Third Industrial Revolution. So computerization of factories run by computers and people being replaced by robots in these big factories. So there's a lot of history sits behind these theories of mind and behavior, these big four schools of psychology, and the history can tell us a lot about how psychology has found its place in the world. So this first argument is that there's a link between the major schools of psychology and what was happening in the Industrial Revolution. Initially, lots of people moving into the cities and people worried about the chaotic nature of life, because never had so many people living in cities before. And then with the industrial revolutions and factories, people coming along and having behaviorism and viewing human nature as like a machine. And then when cognitivism came along, we had people being viewed as though they were computers. So there's this link. Anyway, we're going to explore that a little more next week. And next week, we're going to have more on the histories of psychoanalysis, behaviorism and cognitivism, but we're going to also bring in biological psychology. And what we'll do is see what psychology says about self and society, about how society fits into psychology, and we'll get a better sense of psychology's place in the world. So ordinarily, what we'd have now would be 10 minutes for some comments or questions, but because I'm off sick, you're not going to be able to ask me questions directly. So I've set up a discussion board for you on VU Collaborate. It just sits underneath of the week 11 materials for the history of psychology. So post your comments and questions there on the discussion board, so everyone can see them, and everyone will be able to see my responses too. And I look forward to meeting up with you next week. Thanks for listening and thanks for watching. See you soon. Cheers.